His teacher never acknowledged him in class until the day she chose to embarrass him in front of everyone. But once he began to play, the expression on her face said everything. She hadn't expected that. Elijah Rivers sat by the window, his pencil tapping rhythmically on the edge of his notebook. It wasn't from anxiety, just a habit, one his mother always told him to quit, but it helped him concentrate. In the classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, the usual buzz of chatter filled the air before class. Still, Elijah remained focused on the worksheet before him. He liked finishing early. Miss Abigail Thornton stood at the front, skimming through her lesson notes. She'd been teaching 6th grade for almost 15 years and had earned a reputation over time tough but fair, at least to the students she favored. Elijah was never one of them. It wasn't blatant. She never raised her voice or made harsh comments, but she rarely called on him even when his hand was in the air. When he answered correctly, she moved on without pause. But when he got something wrong, though rare she lingered, as if enjoying it. Elijah noticed. So did a few others. "Yo, she barely even sees you." Tyler Whitman, the kid next to him, whispered one day, "You've got, like, teacher invisibility or something." Elijah only shrugged. "Guess so." But today felt different. Miss Thornton kept glancing in his direction, not with suspicion, but with something else. Curiosity. Class began, a typical history discussion, this one on the Civil War. Elijah jotted notes quietly, expecting the same routine. Then something unexpected happened. "Elijah," Miss Thornton said, her tone firm, "why don't you take this one?" Heads turned toward him. Elijah blinked in surprise. She never picked him. He straightened in his seat, eyes scanning the board. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military operation designed to cripple the Confederacy's supplies and morale. She said. Not bad at all. It was a flawless textbook response. A few students exchanged surprised looks. Tyler shot him a glance that said, "What was that about?" The lesson went on, but something had shifted. Miss Thornton wasn't overlooking him anymore, she was paying attention. Then, just before the bell, she made her move. "Elijah," she said, as students began gathering their things, "stay behind for a minute." Heads turned again, but no one spoke. Elijah moved slowly, putting his notebook away before walking up to her desk. "I overheard you the other day," she began, folding her hands together, "mentioning your grandfather." Elijah's brow furrowed. "What about him? You said he was a musician." Her voice had a strange weight to it. He gave a small nod. "Yeah, he was a jazz pianist." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close. "Interesting." She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. "You've probably picked up a few things, then." Elijah didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what she was leading to, but something about it felt off. "A little," he replied. Her grin widened, but it lacked warmth. "Good to know." The bell sounded. Elijah reached for his backpack and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Tomorrow," she said. "Let's see what you've got." He looked back, puzzled. "What?" She gestured toward the old upright piano in the back of the room, collecting dust in the corner. "That piano. You'll play something for the class." Elijah stared at her. A few students who hadn't left yet watched silently from the doorway, their eyes darting between them. "Why?" Miss Thornton tilted her head slightly, as if the question amused her. "Why not? You said your grandfather was a pianist. I'm sure you inherited some of that talent." Elijah recognized the tone. It wasn't genuine curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a trap. But he wasn't going to back down. That night, Elijah hardly slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Miss Thornton's words looping through his mind. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a test, and he knew exactly the kind. She expected him to mess up, to humiliate himself, to confirm whatever bias she already carried about him. But she didn't know the whole story. The following morning, Elijah entered the classroom carrying the weight of something unspoken. News had spread quickly. As he took his seat, whispers trailed behind him. "You really playing today?" Brandon Hall, one of the loudmouths, called out with a smirk. Elijah didn't respond. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Tyler said softly beside him. Elijah kept his eyes down, fixed on his notebook. "There's a lot people don't know." Miss Thornton walked in, placing her books on the desk with a certain smugness. She gave little attention to the settling class, her gaze drifting toward Elijah before she started the day's lesson. The first portion of class crawled by, but Elijah barely registered any of it. His mind kept racing forward, waiting for the moment she would single him out, and then it came. "Well," she said, snapping her book shut and glancing at the time, "we've got a few extra minutes before our next topic." "Perfect." She turned toward the dusty upright piano in the back. "Elijah, let's see what you've got." The mood shifted. Students squirmed in their chairs, some whispering, others watching intently. Elijah stayed seated for a beat longer, feeling the weight of every eye. His heart wasn't racing, but it thudded with purpose. Then he stood. A couple of students snickered under their breath as he walked calmly toward the piano. Someone muttered something he couldn't make out, but he didn't need to hear the words. The tone was enough. Miss Thornton folded her hands. "Play whatever you like." Elijah examined the instrument. It was aged, keys slightly yellowed with time, some chipped along the edges. He brushed his fingers across them once, feeling their imperfections. It was a little out of tune, not terribly so, but noticeable. He drew a breath, took a seat, placed his fingers gently on the keys. He already knew the piece he would play. Then came a sound, someone trying to hold in a laugh, a low snort that didn't go unnoticed. But this wasn't just about proving Miss Thornton wrong anymore. This was about proving everyone wrong, and he planned to do it in a way they'd remember. The room fell still, quieter than it had ever been. Even Miss Thornton, usually so confident and self-assured, now wore a curious expression. The students leaned forward, anticipating. Some waited for him to crash and burn. Others were simply there for the show. Elijah rested his fingers on the piano keys. They felt familiar beneath his touch, even though this instrument was nothing like the one back home. His grandfather's piano had a warmth to it, deep, rich tones that filled a room with ease. This one, its keys were a bit rigid, the soundboard likely bent from years of neglect. He took a deep breath, paused briefly in stillness, and then began to play. The opening notes flowed into the room, gentle and deliberate, a smooth blues rhythm, the kind his grandfather used to play for hours on muggy Arkansas afternoons. Elijah's hands moved with certainty, the chords rolling under his fingers. His left hand held the rhythm steady, while his right traced out the melody with grace. The atmosphere shifted. All whispers stopped. Even the students who had snickered moments earlier were now still. Miss Thornton crossed her arms, a slight furrow forming between her brows. She had expected nerves, a hesitant beginning, but what she heard was far from what she had anticipated. Elijah didn't glance at the class. He wasn't performing for them anymore. This was for him, for his grandfather. He gave in to the music completely, feeling each note as if it were telling a story only he could understand. His fingers flowed easily, balancing precise technique with honest emotion. It wasn't just skill, it was a dialogue between him and the instrument. Then he pushed further. He took a chance. He shifted into a more intricate section, letting his hands race through elaborate runs up and down the keyboard, a sequence his grandfather had taught him, one he'd struggled to learn for months before finally getting it right. A deep, rolling bass line rumbled beneath a melody that soared, notes clashing and resolving in beautiful harmony. As the piece went on, the silence in the room grew thicker, pressing down around them like the music itself. No one was laughing anymore, Tyler, seated near the front, leaned in, eyes wide. Brandon, who'd made fun earlier, sat with arms folded, but the smirk was gone. Across the room, a few students exchanged looks, their faces reflecting not just surprise but something closer to respect. And then came the crescendo. Elijah's fingers pressed with intention, striking powerful chords that rang against the classroom walls. The music surged, spilling into every corner of the classroom, filling the spaces where uncertainty once lingered. Elijah pressed forward, letting the final sequence of notes carry the weight of everything he'd never voiced, and then silence. The last note hovered for a beat, then dissolved into the air. Elijah slowly lifted his hands, letting them rest in his lap. No one moved, no one spoke. A single clap broke the stillness from the back of the room, then another, then more. Within seconds, the whole class was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. Damn. Brandon, still seated with arms folded, gave a slight shake of his head. I didn't know he had that in him. Elijah exhaled deeply. His heart wasn't racing from anxiety, it pulsed from the force of what he had just done. He hadn't just played. He had shifted the entire room. The applause grew louder, students exchanging glances like they had just witnessed something rare and unforgettable. But the quietest reaction came from Miss Thornton. Her expression was unreadable. She stood stiffly at her desk, arms crossed, lips pressed into a firm line. Applause echoed around her, but she remained still, saying nothing. Elijah stayed seated, hands calm in his lap, breathing slowly. He wasn't grinning, wasn't searching for validation. He let the moment breathe, allowing everyone to absorb what had just unfolded. Then, finally, Miss Thornton spoke. Well, she said curtly, that was unexpected. The clapping faded, students now glancing between her and Elijah. A few whispers still lingered, but the mood had changed. It wasn't just about the music anymore. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked, her head tilting slightly. Elijah held her gaze steady. My grandfather. Something flickered across her features, but it vanished too quickly to define. She straightened. I see. A pause. Her fingers tapped lightly on her desk, the only sound in a room that had fallen quiet again. Then she turned to face the rest of the class, as if brushing away whatever had been on her mind. All right, let's get back to our lesson. But no one moved. Elijah looked around. Tyler was still staring at him, eyebrows lifted. As if he couldn't believe what had just happened, Tyler stared in disbelief. In the back of the room, Madison Green looked irritated, as though the moment had ended too abruptly. Brandon scoffed under his breath. That's it. Miss Thornton's gaze snapped toward him. Excuse me. Brandon shifted in his seat with a shrug. I mean, that's all you're going to say. He just played. He motioned vaguely, like something off a soundtrack, and you're just moving on. A few students nodded in agreement. Miss Thornton's lips drew into a firm line. This is a classroom, not a talent competition. Elijah inhaled slowly, grounding himself. You didn't think I could actually play, he said evenly. Her eyes snapped back to him, narrowed and evaluating. He held her gaze. That's why you called me up here. Soft murmurs stirred across the room. Miss Thornton exhaled carefully. I gave you a chance to share your skills with the class. Elijah shook his head. No, you didn't. His tone remained steady. You thought I'd mess it up, that's the real reason you asked. The whispers grew louder. Miss Thornton's hand tensed, fingers curling against the edge of her desk. That's enough, Elijah. But he kept going. You wouldn't have asked Tyler. He said, nodding at his friend, or Madison, or Brandon, but you picked me. Why? The entire room felt like it was holding its breath. Miss Thornton's jaw clenched, her posture going rigid. You're out of line. I don't think I am. Her eyes narrowed. Her stance grew more severe. Sit down. For the first time that school year, Elijah didn't obey immediately. Instead, he looked around at classmates who had once ignored him, at those who'd underestimated him, at the few who had chuckled when his name was called earlier. Then, deliberately, he rose. The silence now felt electric, thick with unspoken thoughts. Miss Thornton, usually composed, seemed a bit off balance, but this moment wasn't hers to control. Elijah walked back to his seat, slowly, aware of the room's attention trailing his every step. His heart wasn't pounding anymore. No nerves, just clarity. He eased into his chair, still feeling the stares. Tyler nodded at him, a quiet gesture that didn't need explanation. Madison's eyes stayed locked on Miss Thornton, arms folded, as if she, too, expected more to be said. But Miss Thornton had already turned away. She opened her lesson plan, eyes locked on the paper, as though she could will the moment away, pretend nothing had happened. Let's continue. But the class didn't slip back to normal the way she had anticipated. The tension still hung in the air. Low whispers carried on. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. Brandon leaned back in his seat, arms folded across his chest. Kinda strange how you don't want to talk about it. Miss Thornton looked up sharply. Excuse me? Brandon gave a casual shrug. You made a thing out of him playing, but now it's like it didn't happen at all. Soft murmurs rippled again through the class. Her fingers gripped the lesson book tighter. That's enough. But Elijah had noticed the flicker of hesitation, the awkward pause, and so had everyone else. For the rest of the period, her authority didn't feel the same. It was thinner, like a pane of glass with a hairline crack. She kept control of the class, but the energy had shifted. The usual flow was missing. By the time the bell rang, chairs screeched against the floor, and students gathered their belongings, talking quietly as they made their way out. Elijah slung his backpack over one shoulder and started for the exit, but just before he crossed the threshold, Miss Thornton called after him, "Elijah." He paused and turned. For a moment it looked like she might say something honest, something real. But then her expression hardened. "I trust you understand this is still my classroom." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the same calm voice from earlier, he replied, "I do." There was a pause, silent, charged before he turned and left. In the hallway, Tyler jogged up beside him. "Dude, what was that?" he said, grinning. "You just flipped the whole room upside down." Elijah exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Tyler nudged him with an elbow. "So you gonna play again?" Elijah thought for a second about the feel of the keys under his hands, about how the music filled the room. He smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Because today, he hadn't just played a song, he had finally been heard. That afternoon, Elijah walked home with a lighter step. The sun hung low over West Markham Street, casting long shadows as he took the familiar path, and the burden he'd carried since yesterday, the pressure, the uncertainty, gone. At the corner market near his block, Elijah paused to grab a bottle of water. Mr. Henson, the elderly shop owner, gave him a knowing glance. "You look like a kid who just did something big." Elijah paused, then offered a small smile. "Maybe I did." By the time he made it home, the scent of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother stood at the stove humming softly as she flipped a fillet. "You're late," she said. Elijah dropped his backpack near the doorway and took a seat at the kitchen table. It was a long day. She glanced over her shoulder, good or bad. He thought for a moment, thought about the silence in the classroom, Miss Thornton's stunned face, the way his peers had looked at him, really seen him, maybe for the first time. "Good," he answered eventually, "really good." She turned off the stove burner and wiped her hands with a towel before taking a seat across from him. "Wanna tell me what happened?" Elijah nodded. For the next 15 minutes, he recounted everything. She didn't cut in, didn't speed him along, just listened, her face moving between concern, pride, and something gentler, a trace of sorrow, perhaps. When he finished, she let out a breath. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." "I think I did." She studied his face. "And how does that make you feel?" He didn't have to search for an answer, like it needed to happen. She smiled, reaching over to gently squeeze his hand. "Good." The next morning at school, things weren't drastically different. Miss Thornton still taught, as she always had called on her regular students, kept her cool demeanor like nothing had shifted, but the air in the classroom was different. Students saw her with new eyes, and they looked at Elijah differently too. At lunch, several students, ones who had never spoken to him before, came by his table. "Dude, you crushed it on that piano," Madison said, taking the seat across from him. "How long you been playing?" "Since I was 5. Tyler shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Elijah gave a sly smile. "Guess so." Across the lunch room, Miss Thornton passed by with her tray. Their eyes met for just a moment, but this time she was the one to look away first. And Elijah, he simply kept eating, because he had already said it all. He needed to express that some lessons can't be found in textbooks, some experiences shift perspectives whether people are ready for it or not. Miss Thornton had spent the entire year overlooking Elijah, and in just a handful of minutes he made sure she would never overlook him again. Maybe she'd never say it directly, maybe she'd never acknowledge her mistake or admit the assumptions she made, but that no longer mattered because Elijah now understood something she didn't. When others try to quiet you or dismiss your potential, the most powerful response is to let your gift speak louder than their skepticism, and once you do, they'll have no option but to hear you. If this story struck a chord, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the stories that stay with us are the ones that remind us to rise no matter who's watching.